Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining in. I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's right at 10 o'clock, so looks like we have a good group on. So I'm Tyler Williams. I'm an extension educator for University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I work primarily in the climate and weather space as it pertains to agriculture. And so this topic was quite a topic all year long in 2019 and likely will continue to be as we go forward. So we're happy to have Dr. Martha Shulski here today. She's Associate Professor, School of Natural Resources, and also the Nebraska State Climatologist and Director of the Nebraska State Climate Office. So today she's going to give us just a brief glimpse into the flooding event that happened in 2019 and all the things that led up to it, as well as maybe a glimpse into the future and some of the risks that we might be seeing as we go forward. So we'll have the chat box open and the Q&A box open. We'll likely take questions at the end, but feel free to type those in at any time. And if I need to interject, Martha, I will. If not, we'll try to answer some of those when we get to the end. So again, feel free to type into that anytime, and I'll try to keep an eye on that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Martha. And one thing is this will be recorded, is recording, and we'll place this on the weather-ready.unl.edu website afterwards if you want to refer back to any of this. So with that, now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Martha, and you can take it away. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I appreciate you joining in on the conversation here. So there's a lot to talk about. We had a very interesting year this year in terms of flooding that started in March and is continuing. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background. So as Tyler mentioned, I serve as a state climatologist for Nebraska. And if you're not familiar with what we do at the Nebraska State Climate Office, again, located in the School of Natural Resources, our mission is to deliver science-based weather and climate information for decision making. And we do that by providing high quality and timely climate services, engage with stakeholders to understand needs, as well as operate a statewide weather network. And that's the image that you saw on the front slide, opening slide. That was one of our 70 weather stations that we have all across Nebraska. We have one in at least one weather station in about 49 counties. And so our websites are there, so you can come visit us and check us out. So what I'm going to be talking about for today is just to give a little bit of background on floods in Nebraska. Why do they occur? What are the conditions that cause different kinds of floods in Nebraska? What were the weather conditions leading up to the March 2019 event? There was a kind of unique and specific set of weather events that led to this very historic and broad scale flood that we did experience in March and are continuing to experience in a lot of areas. We'll look at some of the significant and ongoing impacts and hopefully put that into a historical context. Look at the flood potential going into next spring. We've stayed pretty wet for a long time now, actually, and so we'll look at what does that mean when we think about flood potential for next year, next spring, and then look at how this fits into the long-term climate trends. How have we changed historically, and where are we headed in the future? So just a little bit of basic background on floods. And floods are kind of unique in that it's a product not only of the natural hazard of heavy precipitation events or springtime snowmelt, but it's also a function of development and what we're doing to the landscape, how we've modified it, dams and levees, those kinds of issues. So it's not only what's going on with the weather, but it's also a product of how we're managing the landscape. And so my area of expertise is in weather and climate, so I'm mostly going to focus on the natural hazard side of things as opposed to the development, but keeping in mind that that's a very important part when we're thinking about and talking about floods. Historically, this large-scale flooding, like we experienced in March of 2019, that typically occurs with one of two things: either heavy and or prolonged rainfall, So lots of rain, excessively wet conditions over a long period of time, like what happened in 1993. That's a great example during the summer where we had a lot of rainfall in the central US, very large scale flooding impacts. Or we can get this large scale flooding with snowmelt and ice jams in the springtime in particular. So when we transition from winter, when things are locked up, the rivers are iced over, there's snow on the ground. When that snowmelt does occur, we can get this large scale flooding. That's what we're going to be talking about here in 2019. Or we can get the localized flooding, which is more flash flooding, so the rapid onset, heavy rain events, several inches in a 24-hour or 48-hour period. Those are the kinds of weather events that produce this flash flooding, which is typically more localized as opposed to the 2019 flood, which was very broad scale. So just some recent past large-scale flooding. So 1993, what I mentioned earlier, that prolonged heavy rainfall, and then 2011, which was a function of excessive wetness, as well as snowmelt conditions in the upper Missouri Basin and how that kind of translated down into Nebraska. So I'll show some perspective of how the Missouri Basin is looking in the runoff this year when compared to 2011. So I just wanted to bring that up here at the beginning. So in terms of, if we look at disasters, where does flood disasters typically occur in Nebraska? So here is kind of a accumulation of the years 1960 to 2012. This is a county by county perspective of the numbers of disasters. So you can see it's somewhat skewed toward the eastern half of the state. The environment is different here, population sizes, vulnerable areas are different for these different portions of the state. Watersheds are somewhat different. So you're seeing a reflection of both kind of weather and population densities in terms of these flood disasters. So these are declared disasters by county. And this information is available in the statewide flood hazard mitigation plan. So this was developed by the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources. So the front of the document I'm showing here, this one is dated at 2013. This piece goes into the Nebraska statewide hazard mitigation plan. That plan is available online. And you can get a county by county look at not only floods, but other hazards as well, like severe storms, blizzards, hail events, those kinds of hazards. So I would encourage you, if you're interested, to dive much more deeply in the mitigation aspect, to visit this document. So in terms of flood mitigation, we can think about kind of reducing. And by mitigation, I mean reducing our impacts to flood events. We can think about those in terms of structural, like dams and levees and so forth. So kind of modifying the flood and how the water flows on the landscape versus non-structural ways that we can look at flood mitigation. So that's adapting our development to precipitation trends and watershed characteristics and so forth. So there are different ways that we can kind of tackle and look at mitigation to flood events. All right, so that just a little bit of background about how flooding occurs and what sort of documents we have in place in Nebraska to look at flood mitigation efforts. So I'll transition something now, kind of let's look at the March 2019 flood and how did that happen. It was devastating, record-setting, very large-scale flood for Nebraska. And one thing that was critical for this March flood was the antecedent conditions. So the weather events leading up to March 13th and 14th, when we got the storm that came through, those were critical for setting the stage for this very large scale flood. We did have a wet fall and winter, These images I took from NOAA, National Center for Environmental Information. So anything in green there, all the states are above average. Nebraska was much above average for the September through February precipitation rankings. So you can see Nebraska has the number 120. That means we were fifth wettest on record for the fall and winter seasons combined. You can see much of the eastern half of the US was in the above to much above to even record wettest. There were some states in the eastern seaboard there that were record wettest. That's if they have a number 124, that means record-setting wetness. So for Nebraska, north central US, we were quite wet. So this takes us through February. What was going on with the temperatures? We were 8th coldest in Nebraska for the month of February. You can see, so there's the 8 ranking there in the image for Nebraska. Anything in blue, any of the states in blue, below to much below average temperatures for the month of February. Anything in the orange colors is above average for the month of February. So the north central US was quite cold. Cold conditions this time of year, what that does is allow the soils to freeze to a significant depth in some cases. So we had wet conditions and then we had cold conditions in February. So the soils, because of the wet conditions, the soils are at or near saturation. They're also frozen because we have been cold. And what you're looking at here, what I've just popped up on the screen, is a modeled perspective of soil moisture ranking. So there's a lot of green that you can see on this map. So by February, we've had a very wet fall and winter season already. So you can see the soils are fairly saturated. A lot of Nebraska is in the 99th percentile ranking, which is very high. So the soils, there's anything that falls on it is not going to be able to be to soak in. In addition, conditions are also frozen. And because of the cold, the rivers and streams are frozen. There's a lot of ice that's developing on these river systems. Snowfall was fairly plentiful for the winter. I think Lincoln and Omaha set records for high snowfall amounts for the winter. And what you're seeing on the right side of the screen there, that's a snow water equivalent. I'm not sure how well you can see these, the numbers here, but in the purple shades here that you see, that's in the couple inches of water equivalent that is sitting on top of a frozen and saturated ground. So the dates here, so here we're looking at late February, and this one happens to be March 11th. This is a remotely sensed product, so it's giving you kind of this good spatial view of what the snowpack looks like you can tell there's a pretty significant snowpack and water that's sitting on the landscape in early March. So along comes this late winter storm, which is not extremely unusual for us to have these storm events, especially during the transition time of year. You've probably heard the term bomb cyclone, which is essentially, it's not a new term. It's new maybe in the popular nomenclature, but it's not necessarily a new term in the meteorology sense. And what a bomb cyclone means is that it's a storm that strengthens very rapidly. So it reduces or intensifies by 24 millibars in a 24-hour time period. So here's a satellite image. You can see, you can kind of picture the low pressure system on March 13th. The central pressure was 968 millibars, which is roughly equivalent to a Category 2 hurricane strength. We did have very persistent and quite strong high winds, kind of in the high plains and the Intermountain West. There's some wind records that were broken. So in Nebraska, we did have blizzard conditions for the western half of the state and some very significant impacts that went along with the blizzard, much less the flooding in the east. This storm event was fairly consistent in the forecast. So weather forecasts typically go out about 10 to 14 days in advance. That's about kind of the weather forecasting range as far out as we can go. And it was fairly consistently, this storm was in the forecast. So we had a pretty good indication that an intense storm was going to make its way across the central US. The exact amount of precipitation and the exact track, that's more difficult to tell 10 days in advance, but we knew something was headed our way. So this storm comes through. There's, again, there's blizzard conditions in the west. Part of Nebraska was snow. There is rainfall in the eastern half of the state. Rainfall was on the order of several inches of precipitation. The temperatures were not extremely cold, and so you've got this rain that's falling on several inches of water sitting in that snowpack. And when rain falls on snow, then you get pretty quick melting of that. So we had ice jams in place, we had snow melt happening very rapidly, and then heavy rain. So all those combined are very significant contributors to this scale of event that we did have. What you're seeing on the screen here are some images that I grabbed from the Omaha Valley National Weather Service office. They did an excellent job of getting the message out and looking at this event as it unfolded. We had on the lower portion of this, those are new record crests at the locations and at the rivers that they did occur. There's about 24 locations in Nebraska where we did have record flooding, and you see some in Iowa and other areas. And in the upper right, you can see the scale. You know, it not only impacted Nebraska, but South Dakota, southern Minnesota, Iowa, and into Missouri. So this was a pretty large-scale regional kind of event here. And if I can do the technology correctly, I'm going to flip to a look at, this is stream flow that you're looking at. I apologize, it's a little bit small. So now we're at March 10th. The black is rivers above flood stage. So you can see at March 13th onward, this just influx of these blue and black colors here. So now we're at the end of March. I'm going to let it loop through again so you can see. So we'll start at March 1st. So things are pretty much frozen, locked in place at this point. Here we're at March 10th. You can see by March 13th, just the massive scale of rivers above flood stage. Again, this is from the USGS. This is on their Water Watch website. If you have an interest in looking at conditions, they're updated. You can get daily and weekly river stages. All right. Flip back to my PowerPoint here. Okay. So given the conditions that we had, the scale of everything, the impacts are essentially at historic levels here. The Nebraska Emergency Management Department, this is an image that I gathered from their website. This was updated, I believe, in October. So there were some, if you happen to see this image earlier in the year, there were some new counties that were added, I think because of the summertime rainfall events that we did get. But again, this just shows you, so 81 county emergency declarations, 104 city emergency declarations, the 5 tribal areas in Nebraska. So it just, again, just shows you the scale of the event that we're dealing with here. Now the full, what I've got is the last bullet point here, the full impact is certainly something that is yet to be realized. The recovery is ongoing for many communities. I know that the community of Winslow, they're being relocated. They had a event last night, a community event, kind of bringing folks together and talking about a path forward. So this is an ongoing issue that will be ongoing for many communities. But in terms of some of the significant impacts, of course, the failure of Spencer Dam and the impacts associated with that, that was a significant one. There was 4 deaths associated with this flood last I looked. One of those deaths occurred from a Nebraskan that was helping in Iowa. Lots of cattle losses, not only from the flood, but from the blizzard conditions in western Nebraska. Of course, lots of towns and communities that were cut off temporarily. Some obviously that are looking at relocation now. Lots of damages to homes and businesses. The images on the right-hand side that you see, that's somebody's home, and that is ice and debris that's being brought with the ice that has made its way inside somebody's house. Roads completely destroyed, farmland destroyed, sand on farmland, loss of stored grain, water quality concerns. Of course, anytime you have a flood, there's concerns with the water quality aspect of it. And I think something to be cognizant of is the toll that this event takes in terms of the mental health and communities that are trying to rebuild and find a path forward, and what that does to somebody's mental health. Last I looked, the damages were estimated about $2 billion. Again, very, very significant kinds of event. 400,000 acres could not be planted, so those were termed prevent plant acres. Nebraska actually, in terms of prevent plant, fared somewhat well. Relatively speaking, I believe in South Dakota there was 3.4 million acres that were prevented plant. So lots of significant impacts. But again, the full impact of this is yet to be determined. So I mentioned earlier that we knew, the conditions were such that it would lead to an increased risk for flooding. The NOAA, the National Weather Service, they look at flood risk when we're coming out of the winter. How are we categorized? And so the National Weather Service did have us in an elevated flood risk category in February. And I'm just showing you a slide here. This is from one of the Weather Service briefings. I believe it's from the Omaha office, where they identify there's a much above normal risk for spring flooding this year. Again, this was the March 7th spring flood outlook, identifying high soil moisture, elevated stream flows, and the existing snowpack. So the conditions that I talked about earlier, that's what led to this categorization of much above normal risk. Furthermore, there's an increased risk for major flooding this year. And they mentioned since the last outlook 2 weeks ago, so they're regularly posting these kinds of briefings here. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of transition a bit to past the March event. How kind of has the summer gone? How has the weather during the summer impacted recovery from the flood events? And one thing to note is that even though we did experience this very historic event, but the precipitation that we got during the summer has really hampered some of the recovery efforts that have been going on around the state. What you're looking at here is a county by county look at precipitation rankings going back to 1895 to 2019. And a lot of Nebraska is in this much above average category here. Heavy rain in early July, some of you probably remember a large swath of south central Nebraska. There was 4 inches or more in early July over a 10 county area. So a big pretty big area of Nebraska experienced some very significant rainfall and a lot of impacts to some Central Platte communities. Kearney was one of them. So that was July, and into August, we actually had the wettest August on record for Nebraska, going back to 1895. So the hits just kind of kept on coming for us, for portions of Nebraska anyway. The south central part of the state was hardest hit. In August, there was 16 inches in total near Doniphan, which is well above normal for an August total. Okay, so we'll look a little bit later. So this was September. Here, the image I'm showing you is a percent of normal precipitation. And so you can see for Nebraska, it wasn't all wet, but I just wanted to point out the heavy rainfall that was experienced in the kind of the eastern sections of Nebraska, as well as the north central portion of the state. And you can see kind of where the wetness was for the U.S. as a whole. So again, the Missouri Basin has stayed much above average for a lot of 2019 and previous to 2019. So some of you may remember this locally very heavy rainfall for the Ainsworth area, where they got 8 inches in a 2-day time period, which is much more than what they normally get in September. You know, later in summer and into fall, that's when our precipitation typically, you know, we're heading toward our seasonal minimum, which is winter. That's our lowest water equivalent precipitation, whereas most of our precipitation we usually get in late spring and early summer. That's kind of our peak. So by September, we should be trailing off a bit in terms of precipitation, but that didn't happen this year. And again, you can see kind of the regional nature to this wetness. And for those of you that are along the Missouri, kind of in northeast Nebraska and in eastern Nebraska, the Missouri River up to 6 foot above flood stage at Brownville and Rouleau, and it's still above flood stage. So these impacts are continuing, that started back in March. Okay, so let's look at 2019 as a whole. So if we look at the calendar year precipitation, kind of a US perspective here, you can see the rankings here. So Nebraska's in the much above normal category for January to October. We've got the number 123, and that means we are third wettest on record for Nebraska for that 10-month time period. You can see the scale of the wetness and how much of the US that this excessively wet conditions covers. I don't have the November statistics were not quite out yet. They should be by the end of the week. And so we'll be able to look at kind of the 11 months of 2019. But that's kind of where we stand in terms of year-to-date precipitation. Okay, so we've been quite wet. What you're seeing here is a look at kind of this top layer. This is a 4-inch. It's not surface to 4-inch, but it's just at the 4-inch depth. What does our soil moisture conditions look like? This is information from the Nebraska Mesonet. So this is where we have weather stations that we operate across the state. And the number that you're seeing here is the percent of total volume. So how much volume is at the 4-inch depth is taken up by water. So right now the average soil temperature is a little bit above freezing, so we haven't quite frozen yet. And you can see for the eastern section and south central portions of Nebraska, it's showing kind of the 30% range, which is pretty high because the other part of the soil is taken up by the soil particles itself or any air pockets that's in there, organic material. So these numbers that you see on the screen, anything kind of in the yellow and green colors mean that these are wet conditions out here. So we're looking at point locations, and this we observe under non-irrigated soil. So this is just natural vegetation that these observations are taken under. We do have moisture and temperature conditions available on a daily basis. So you can go to mesonet.unl.edu under our daily maps feature and look at this as it progresses throughout the season. So we'll step back kind of and look at the national perspective here. So I showed you kind of Nebraska. This image, again, it's a modeled product, and we're looking at a percentile ranking here. You can see how a lot of the Missouri Basin, kind of the upper Midwest, is in the green and the darker green color. So even a portion of Nebraska is in the 99th percentile ranking in terms of soil moisture. So again, precipitation that falls in these areas it's not going to be able to be infiltrated by the soil. Okay. So that was a look at soil conditions, look at stream flow conditions. So how are we starting the winter as rivers and streams start to freeze over? What are the flows as this starts to happen? So here you're looking at a snapshot. This is just taken a month ago. Again, this is USGS stream flow information, and you're seeing a lot of blue and some black colors here. So this is by basin. So this is confined to the Missouri Basin. So all of Nebraska lies within the Missouri Basin. Again, so you're just seeing a byproduct of these excessively wet conditions and very high flows here. And I did want to include some information. This is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And so they're managing releases and looking at flood storage and how that water should be kind of removed from the system. And so you can see kind of the language here that's provided by the Corps of Engineers. So they're slightly ahead of schedule in evacuating the flood control storage of the Missouri River main stem system. It's allowing the Corps to reduce releases slightly at the end of November. Even with the slightly reduced reservoir releases, the Corps will evacuate all stored floodwaters by the beginning of next runoff season, which is about March 1st. And the flood storage capacity will be emptied out for the 2020 runoff season, which was a very important factor to consider when looking at the 2020 year. So to put this in the context of what conditions were like in 2011, when we had similar wet conditions and a lot of snow that year, forecasted calendar year runoff as of November 1st is 60 million acre feet. That's at about 238% of normal. This will be the second highest runoff year in the upper Missouri Basin, which is above Sioux City here. And this is slightly behind the 2011. So in terms of 2019, the Missouri Basin, this is how it compares to 2011. All right, so given where the soil moisture is, given where the stream flows are and releases that are able to be done by the Corps of Engineers, let's take a look at what does this mean in terms of going into 2020. Are we going to have a repeat? What conditions do we need to be looking out for? So this is the winter climate outlook that is produced by the Climate Prediction Center. So on the left, we have a temperature outlook, and this is a probability of occurrence for warmer than normal, equal chances for cooler, warmer than normal, or cooler than normal. So you don't, we'll just focus on the temperature outlook, and you'll see that we don't see any blue on the map. So the odds are tilted. The dice are weighted toward this warmer than normal for much of the country. there's not a good indication either way for the northern plains. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of guidance in terms of how the temperatures will play out this winter. Part of that is likely this lack of a signal in the equatorial Pacific. When looking at El Nino or La Nina, we're in neutral conditions. So that's typically something that drives these seasonal outlooks, especially in wintertime, but there's not that signal to go on this year. So we could think about what goes on, say, in the Arctic or other parts of the globe that kind of influence these large-scale patterns, the patterns of the jet stream, influence of cold air outbreaks. What goes on in the Arctic could play more of a stronger role. That's generally less predictable than something like El Nino, certainly not able to be predicted months in advance, like El Nino typically is. And if we look at the image on the right, that's the precipitation outlook for winter. So December, January, February, they're looking at persistence. The chances are high for persistence of the wet conditions that we have been experiencing. It's for a fairly large swath of the north central US. You can see how much of Nebraska is in this category. So it's more for areas further to our north. Chances are higher than for us in Nebraska. But still something that we should be thinking about as we head into this next spring. So because of these conditions, because the soil moisture is where it is, because of the climate outlooks and projections, NOAA, the National Weather Service, their central region has put together the following document. And the headline here, extremely wet conditions heading into the late fall and winter, sets the stage for a difficult spring flood season. So they're already thinking about next spring. You know, we're at the start of December here, but conditions are such that we should be thinking about what next spring will bring when snow melts and so forth. And it's not that often that we think about the springtime when we're just heading into the winter. Some of the impacts that have been identified, and these, if you think back to this image here, a lot of this darker green color, you can see how much of Nebraska it influences here. So a lot of these impacts are more so probably for areas further to our north, but we're right on the margin here in Nebraska. And so something that we should be taking into consideration. So some of the potential impacts for the upcoming winter and spring season, rivers freezing above flood stage, freezing of overland flooding, water that's sitting on a saturated ground, freezing, long-term soil damages, you know, for those soils that were damaged during the March event and others, you know, what will that do to the soils and the profile? Widespread ice jams, including on some rivers that are not usually affected by ice jams. Widespread record flooding again next spring. And then delay or prevention of crop planting. And so again, if we compare to the 2019 season, there was about 400,000 acres of prevented planting or areas that could not be planted due to the wetness in 2019. So that could be something that we need to take into consideration, again, for 2020. And I think for Nebraska's, you know, a lot of this could be dependent, again, on how much of a snowpack we get. Is it going to be above normal or below normal? And the temperature conditions. How much water will be able to infiltrate the ground? You know, will it be frozen, and how saturated will it be? I think those are some key things to keep an eye on and keep track of as we're heading into the spring. All right. So in terms of reduction of impacts, what are things that we can be doing now, given that we did experience this very significant flood? I guess a silver lining here, when you do experience a large scale event, that tells you areas that you need to work on, or what sorts of things can we improve upon for the next extreme event that is going to happen at some point. So where were there gaps in preparedness and emergency operating plans? FEMA and NEMA have done a great job of bringing the community together, and this image is from one of their stakeholder meetings back in April. So they've really been involved in diagnosing this event and looking at where we can improve in terms of a planning perspective. And another aspect would be communication of severity and taking action on the warning. So were there any gaps in where communication or there was a breakdown, or warnings were not taken into consideration? So those are some things that we can think about for the next event, kind of at the planning perspective. In terms of, say, the physical landscape, what are some things that we can do? In terms of snow control, if we have a big snow season, and given the flood potential, if we note that there's culverts blocked with snow and crop debris, which I understand was the case this March, is it possible to clear those out in advance of the event? Or ice control, ice jams were a significant issue in 2019. Is there something that we can possibly do better by looking at problem areas and choke points in river channels? And then certainly from a land management perspective, looking at at-risk infrastructure and identifying those that are areas that are most vulnerable, as well as looking at the soil profile and how well is water going to infiltrate the ground. So those are some things that we can be thinking about and looking at as we head into another potential flood season. Okay, so just kind of to finish up here, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the climate trends that we have experienced. And so I'll show some imagery that looks at historical trends in Nebraska, as well as future projections. And if we think about long-term risk for flooding, what sort of things should we be thinking about for Nebraska? So I mentioned that February was quite cold, and that's one of the factors that set the stage for the large-scale flooding that we had. And if we look at wintertime temperatures in Nebraska, this is a rate of change. So have we been warming or cooling in Nebraska overall? And winters over the long term, if we go back to 1895, we see, so you see a lot of red here. So we've been warming up overall over the last 100 years in Nebraska, pretty much for all seasons, and winter as well. But one thing that I think is interesting is during the most recent, say 30 years or so, this image is this rate of change that you're seeing on the right-hand side is from 1987 to 2016. So for that 30-year time period, we've actually been cooling a bit. And I think this winter and this February in particular, it kind of exemplifies that this recent trend in winter temperatures that we've been experiencing. So that's kind of one aspect to consider. And looking at precipitation, on an annual average basis, Nebraska, we've increased precipitation by about 10%. So we've gotten about 10% wetter over the last 100 years. A lot of that has been driven by springtime precipitation conditions. So again, this is spring, long-term rate of change. You can see kind of these light green colors on the left image. So we've gotten slightly wetter. But that trend has accelerated in recent decades. So since about 1987, springs have gotten significantly wetter. So this is March, April, May time period. So when we think about flooding and these large-scale flooding events in particular, these recent trends, kind of these images on the right-hand side that I was showing, are something that we need to be cognizant of. And then finally, flood risk going forward. So if we think about not just 2020, but 2040 and beyond, and think about how we should design dams and levees and things of that nature. You know, what is Nebraska's, in terms of the weather events that we experience and our climate, what is that going to look like 20 years from now? Not just next year, but 20 years from now. And if we look at the future climate trends, these three bullet points are some items that I wanted to highlight. And that is that heavy rain events will increase. Compared to what they are now, we can expect more of those heavy rain events. Precipitation trends, precipitation during the cold time of year, that shows an increase. So during the winter and spring months, we're looking about a 10 to 15% increase in precipitation. Now, granted, this is not winter and spring. Winter's not the time of year where we experience a lot of our annual precipitation. But again, we're getting this during the cold time of year, during the time when soils are potentially frozen so it can't infiltrate, or during a time when, you know, the plants are not actively growing, so we're not actively using a lot of that precipitation that we're getting. And then another important consideration is that the timing can be everything when it comes to these big, large-scale events. You know, had the soils not been frozen or saturated like they were, that this bomb cyclone that tracked across the country, it probably wouldn't have been nearly as significant as it was. And so the events that come together at a certain time can really mean everything when it comes to these big, large-scale events. And then in terms of thinking about a risk assessment, the infrastructure side of things and land management certainly play a key role in mitigating and dealing with these future climate trends that I've outlined here. All right, so I just wanted to provide some resources for you all. There's a lot of good information available from the natural resource districts, kind of at the basin level. Nebraska Department of Natural Resources, if you'd like to review the flood hazard mitigation plan, it's available on their website. If you're interested in dams and levees, there's a lot of good information there looking at risk of the dams and levees in Nebraska. There's some interactive graphics that are really good. You know, certainly keep up to date on Nebraska Emergency Management Agency information. There's a lot of great information on the flood if you're interested further in impacts or the state hazard mitigation plan, then certainly look to NEMA for that. And then finally, Nebraska Extension. You can visit extension.unl.edu, or I believe there's a flood resources webpage there. There's disaster education program within Nebraska. So Extension has really done a lot of great work in reaching out to these communities during this significant event. So I will end it there. I appreciate you all joining the conversation and be happy to try and answer some questions if there are any.
Sure, thanks, Martha. Appreciate that. And yeah, we have a couple questions. And if anyone has additional ones, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box or the chat box. Either one, we'll kind of keep an eye on that. But Martha, I can just read them off to you and you don't have to try to follow and find them. But first question comes from Timothy. And what impact, if any, will increased Rocky Mountain snowmelt due to higher temperatures resulting from climate change have on a flood risk in downstream communities over the next few decades?
Yeah. Yeah, so the climate projections for Rocky Mountain snowpack are for less water equivalent in the snowpack and an earlier snow melt. So those are kind of the two main trends that we need to be aware of. If we look historically, the snowpack has decreased for a majority of the locations that we take observations. That doesn't preclude a heavy snow year. Those events are still going to happen. Variability is quite high in our climate, but in general, the climate projections are for less snowpack and an earlier snow melt. So when we think about reservoirs and water moving down the Platte system, those are two things that need to be taken into consideration.
Okay, and I think you probably answered this next one, but I was reading and not listening all that well, so you can just say ditto. But how much of a role will warm winter temperatures play in reducing spring flood risk due to a less rapid thaw? And I think you just pretty much addressed that.
Yeah, I think that's something that, in thinking about the 2019 event, that extreme cold in February, that was one of the main factors that led to this big, large scale event that we had. So how this 2019-2020 winter plays out, how much snow and the condition of the soils, and if they're frozen or not, those will be factors to keep a watch as we move into the coming season.
Okay, thanks. I only have one other question that's come from a couple different times, and there's been some requests to view this PDF after this, and I didn't know if you'd be willing to share this PDF with people. I could put it on the Weather Ready website with the recording, as well as sending those to people that register, but I didn't know if you're willing and able to share that or not.
Yeah, you bet. Be happy to.
I'll try to see if we have, looks like we might have another questions here. It says, during the July flooding in Hall County, some of our flooded fields had soil moisture probes that indicated the soil took in 1 to 2 inches of flood water. Are there cover crops or planting differently in ditches with active root systems during the winter that could make a substantial difference in spring flooding?
Yeah, so good question. I was at a meeting with the Nebraska Department of Ag folks, and there was somebody from NRCS there, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I believe he said there was 125,000 acres put into cover crops that was kind of attributed to this flood season. And so it will be interesting to see what sort of impact that has, say, going into next year. But I know that's something that the NRCS is really promoting, is keeping the soils covered, reducing erosion, keeping roots in the system, increasing rates of infiltration. That's it. Yeah, I think that's a very good question there.
Okay, I think I have any other questions.
I see one, Tyler, about flood insurance.
Oh, okay, there we go. Yes, you want?
Yeah, and I'm less familiar with that, but that's something that is administered by NEMA, and typical insurance packages don't include flood, so that's certainly something to consider in added on to whatever insurance package that you have. But so the National Flood Insurance Program, again, administered by FEMA, so something that folks might want to take a look at if that's something that they didn't have in place for 2019.
Okay, thanks. I think that's it now. I think I missed any more. But yeah, thanks again, Martha. Again, for those on, this will be a recording will be posted as well as the PDF version of this, so you can refer back to anything you may have missed or will want to hear it again. So Thanks again, everyone. Thanks, Martha, and everyone have a wonderful week.
Bye-bye.